When Nikita Sergeyevich Khrushchev rose to power in the Soviet Union following Joseph Stalin's death in March 1953, he inherited an empire built on blood, paranoia, and absolute control. The Soviet system Stalin left behind was a colossus of contradictions. A nuclear superpower that couldn't feed its own people. An industrial giant where workers lived in communal apartments without basic plumbing. A supposed workers' paradise where millions languished in labor camps for crimes they never committed. What happened next would transform Soviet society in ways both profound and incomplete, creating a period that historians would later call the thaw, a time when the iron grip of totalitarianism loosened just enough for ordinary people to breathe, but never enough for them to truly be free. The struggle for power after Stalin's death was brutal, and Byzantine played out in the shadows of the Kremlin's corridors. Khrushchev was not the obvious successor. He was a stocky, crude man from a peasant background, lacking the intellectual sophistication of his rivals. Lavrenti Beria, the feared head of the secret police, seemed far more likely to seize control. Georgy Malenkov, who initially took Stalin's position as premier, appeared to have the inside track. But Khrushchev understood something his competitors did not. In the wake of Stalin's terror, the party elite were exhausted, frightened, and desperate for survival. They wanted stability, not another dictator who might turn on them at any moment. Khrushchev positioned himself as a consensus builder, a man of the party rather than above it. By June 1953, he had orchestrated Beria's arrest and execution, eliminating his most dangerous rival. By 1955, he had maneuvered Malenkov out of the premiership. And by 1958, he held both the position of First Secretary of the Communist Party and Chairman of the Council of Ministers, consolidating power in a way not seen since Stalin himself. But Khrushchev was not Stalin, and he knew it. The system of mass terror that had defined Soviet life for decades had become counterproductive. The Gulag system held an estimated 2.5 million prisoners in 1953, draining the economy of productive labor while creating a climate of fear that stifled innovation and initiative. The agricultural sector was in crisis, unable to feed the growing Soviet population despite the country's vast farmlands. Industrial production, while impressive in heavy machinery and military hardware, lagged catastrophically in consumer goods. The Soviet people lived in a state of permanent scarcity, where obtaining basic necessities required hours of queuing, personal connections, and often bribes. Something had to change, and Khrushchev, for all his limitations, recognized this fundamental truth. The moment that would define Khrushchev's rule came on February 25, 1956, during the 20th Party Congress. In a closed session that began late at night and stretched into the early morning hours, Khrushchev delivered what would become known as the secret speech. For nearly 4 hours, he systematically dismantled the cult of personality that had surrounded Stalin, detailing the former dictator's crimes, his paranoia, his violations of socialist legality, and his responsibility for the deaths of innocent party members during the Great Purge of 1936 to 1938. The delegates sat in stunned silence as Khrushchev revealed that of the 139 members and candidates of the Party Central Committee elected at the 17th Party Congress in 1934, 98 persons, or 70%, had been arrested and shot, mostly in 1937 and 1938. He spoke of torture, of false confessions, of Stalin's military incompetence that had cost countless Soviet lives during the Great Patriotic War. The speech was supposed to remain secret, confined to party members, but its contents leaked almost immediately. Within weeks, copies were circulating throughout the Soviet bloc and beyond. The impact was seismic. For millions of Soviet citizens who had been raised to revere Stalin as an almost godlike figure, The revelation of his crimes was psychologically devastating. Some party members committed suicide upon hearing the details. Others experienced a profound crisis of faith in the communist system itself. But for many more, particularly the younger generation and those who had suffered under Stalin's terror, the speech offered validation and hope. Finally, someone at the highest level had acknowledged the truth. The de-Stalinization campaign that followed touched every aspect of Soviet life. Khrushchev initiated a massive release of prisoners from the Gulag system. Between 1954 and 1956, approximately 7 million people were released or rehabilitated, their convictions overturned, their reputations officially restored. Cities and streets named after Stalin were renamed. Stalingrad became Volgograd in 1961. Statues of Stalin were removed from public squares across the Soviet Union. In October 1961, during the 22nd Party Congress, Khrushchev went even further, ordering Stalin's body removed from the Lenin Mausoleum in Red Square and reburied near the Kremlin Wall, a symbolic expulsion from the pantheon of Soviet heroes. But what did this mean for the daily lives of ordinary Soviet citizens? The answer is complex and contradictory, much like Khrushchev himself. On one hand, the thaw brought genuine improvements. The atmosphere of paranoid terror that had characterized Stalin's rule diminished significantly. People could speak more openly, at least in private. The knock on the door at 3 in the morning became less common, though it never disappeared entirely. The secret police, reorganized as the KGB in 1954, remained powerful but operated with somewhat more restraint. Arbitrary arrests for political crimes decreased dramatically, though political repression certainly continued in more subtle forms. Cultural life experienced a genuine flowering during the Khrushchev years. Writers and artists who had been forced into silence or conformity found new space for expression. In 1956, the literary journal Novy Mir published Vladimir Dudintsev's novel Not by Bread Alone, which dared to criticize Soviet bureaucracy and the suppression of individual initiative. In 1962, the same journal published Alexander Solzhenitsyn's One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, a devastating portrait of life in the Gulag, with Khrushchev's personal approval. The publication was a sensation, selling out immediately and sparking intense public discussion about the Stalin era. Young poets like Yevgeny Yevtushenko and Andrei Voznesensky drew crowds of thousands to public readings, their verses touching on themes of individual conscience and historical memory that would have been unthinkable just years earlier. Cinema also experienced a renaissance. Directors like Mikhail Kalatozov produced films of genuine artistic merit that gained international recognition. His 1957 film, The Cranes Are Flying, won the Palme d'Or at Cannes, presenting a nuanced humanistic portrayal of the war years that departed from the heroic propaganda that had dominated Soviet cinema under Stalin. The thaw generation of filmmakers began exploring moral ambiguity, individual psychology, and the costs of war in ways that acknowledged the complexity of human experience. Yet this cultural opening had strict limits, and Khrushchev himself enforced them erratically and often crudely. In December 1962, he visited an exhibition of avant-garde art at the Manege Gallery in Moscow and exploded in rage at the abstract works on display. He shouted insults at the artists, comparing their work to what a donkey could produce with its tail, and threatened them with exile. The incident revealed the fundamental contradiction of Khrushchev's rule. He wanted reform, but only within the boundaries he personally defined, and those boundaries could shift unpredictably based on his moods and political calculations. The housing crisis that Khrushchev inherited was staggering in its severity. In 1950, the average Soviet citizen had access to just 4 square meters of living space. Multiple families commonly shared single apartments, with one family per room and communal kitchens and bathrooms. Privacy was virtually non-existent. Young married couples often lived with parents for years, unable to find their own accommodation. The housing shortage was not just an inconvenience, it was a fundamental obstacle to normal family life and human dignity. Khrushchev attacked this problem with characteristic energy and pragmatism. In 1957, he launched a massive housing construction program based on standardized, prefabricated designs that could be built quickly and cheaply. These buildings, which became known as Khrushchevkas, were typically 5 stories tall, the maximum height that could be built without requiring elevators under Soviet building codes. They were constructed using prefabricated concrete panels with low ceilings, thin walls, small rooms, and minimal amenities. By Western standards, they were barely adequate. By Soviet standards, they were revolutionary. Between 1956 and 1965, the Soviet Union built housing for approximately 108 million people, an achievement staggering in its scale. Millions of families moved from communal apartments and barracks into their own self-contained flats for the first time. These apartments were small, typically between 30 and 50 square meters for a family, but they had their own kitchens and bathrooms. For people who had spent their entire lives sharing facilities with strangers, this represented an enormous improvement in quality of life. The Khrushchevkas were ugly, cramped, and poorly constructed, with walls so thin you could hear your neighbors' conversations. But they gave ordinary Soviet citizens something they had never had before: private, domestic space. The agricultural sector presented Khrushchev with his greatest challenge and ultimately contributed to his downfall. Soviet agriculture had been catastrophically mismanaged since the forced collectivization of the 1930s, when millions of peasants died in famines and the most productive farmers, the kulaks, were eliminated as a class. By the 1950s, the collective farm system was deeply dysfunctional. Farmers had no incentive to work efficiently because they received the same compensation regardless of productivity. Equipment was outdated and poorly maintained. Distribution systems were chaotic and wasteful. The Soviet Union, despite having some of the most fertile farmland in the world, regularly had to import grain. Khrushchev's solution was characteristically bold and ultimately disastrous: the Virgin Lands Campaign. Beginning in 1954, he ordered the cultivation of vast areas of previously unused land in Kazakhstan, Siberia, and the Urals. The plan was to bring 36 million hectares of new land under cultivation, dramatically increasing Soviet grain production. Hundreds of thousands of young people, motivated by idealism, adventure, and economic incentives, volunteered to move to these remote regions to break new ground. The campaign was presented as a heroic endeavor, a new frontier where Soviet youth would transform the landscape through collective effort. Initially, the Virgin Lands Campaign appeared successful. The 1956 harvest was excellent, producing 125 million tons of grain, and Khrushchev was hailed as an agricultural genius. But the success was illusory and unsustainable. Much of the virgin lands consisted of marginal soil in areas with unpredictable rainfall and harsh climates. The intensive cultivation methods used led to rapid soil erosion. Dust storms became common, reminiscent of the American Dust Bowl of the 1930s. By the early 1960s, yields were declining sharply. The 1963 harvest was catastrophic, forcing the Soviet Union to use precious hard currency reserves to import grain from the United States and Canada, a humiliating admission of failure. Khrushchev's other major agricultural initiative was equally misguided. Inspired by a visit to the United States in 1959, where he was impressed by American corn production, he became convinced that corn was the solution to Soviet agricultural problems. He ordered collective farms across the Soviet Union to plant corn, regardless of whether the climate or soil was suitable. The campaign became known derisively as the Corn Campaign. Farmers were forced to plant corn in regions where it could not possibly grow successfully, including areas north of the optimal growing zone. Predictably, the results were poor. The campaign became a symbol of Khrushchev's impulsive decision-making and his tendency to embrace simplistic solutions to complex problems. The housing and agricultural policies revealed a fundamental pattern in Khrushchev's governance. He recognized real problems. He was willing to attempt dramatic solutions, but he lacked the patience and sophistication to implement sustainable reforms. He was a man of action rather than reflection, prone to enthusiasms that he pursued with more energy than wisdom. This pattern would play out repeatedly across his tenure, with mixed results that improved some aspects of Soviet life while creating new problems. In foreign policy, Khrushchev's rule was defined by contradiction and crisis. He genuinely believed in peaceful coexistence with the West, arguing that war between capitalism and communism was not inevitable and that the Soviet system would ultimately triumph through economic competition rather than military conflict. This represented a significant departure from Stalin's more confrontational approach. Yet Khrushchev's pursuit of peaceful coexistence was undermined by his own impulsiveness and by the structural dynamics of the Cold War. The 1956 Hungarian Revolution exposed the limits of de-Stalinization and the thaw. When Hungarian students and workers rose up in October 1956, demanding democratic reforms and the withdrawal of Soviet troops, Khrushchev initially seemed willing to negotiate. The reformist communist Imre Nagy became prime minister and announced Hungary's withdrawal from the Warsaw Pact. But this was too much for the Soviet leadership to accept. In November 1956, Soviet tanks rolled into Budapest, crushing the revolution in brutal street fighting that killed thousands of Hungarians. Nagy was arrested, secretly tried, and executed in 1958. The message was clear. De-Stalinization had limits, and those limits ended at the borders of the Soviet bloc. Satellite states could have more cultural freedom and less internal terror, but they could not choose their own path. The most dangerous moment of Khrushchev's rule, and arguably of the entire Cold War, came in October 1962 with the Cuban Missile Crisis. Khrushchev's decision to secretly deploy nuclear missiles to Cuba was driven by multiple factors: a desire to protect the Cuban Revolution, a need to counterbalance American missiles in Turkey, and a wish to demonstrate Soviet power and resolve. But the operation was poorly planned and executed. American U-2 spy planes discovered the missile sites before they became operational. President John F. Kennedy imposed a naval blockade of Cuba and demanded the missiles' removal. For 13 days, the world teetered on the brink of nuclear war. Soviet submarines armed with nuclear torpedoes patrolled near the blockade line. American strategic forces went to DEFCON 2, one step short of war. At several points, the crisis nearly spiraled into catastrophe through miscommunication and miscalculation. The crisis ended when Khrushchev agreed to remove the missiles in exchange for an American pledge not to invade Cuba and a secret agreement to remove American missiles from Turkey. Khrushchev presented the outcome as a victory, having secured Cuba's safety, but the Kremlin leadership saw it as a humiliating retreat. The crisis had exposed Soviet strategic weakness and revealed Khrushchev's reckless decision-making. The incident significantly undermined his position within the Soviet leadership. The relationship with China deteriorated catastrophically during Khrushchev's rule, creating a split in the communist world with profound long-term consequences. Mao Zedong had never fully accepted Soviet leadership of the communist movement, but the relationship became openly hostile after Khrushchev's secret speech, which Mao saw as a dangerous precedent that could be used against him. Ideological differences deepened, with Mao accusing Khrushchev of revisionism and betrayal of revolutionary principles. By 1960, Soviet advisors were withdrawn from China, taking their blueprints and plans with them, leaving hundreds of industrial projects unfinished. The Sino-Soviet split transformed global geopolitics, creating a three-way dynamic that would eventually allow the United States to pursue rapprochement with China in the 1970s. Daily life for ordinary Soviet citizens under Khrushchev improved in measurable ways, but remained difficult by Western standards. The introduction of the Khrushchevkas meant more families had their own apartments, but consumer goods remained scarce. The Soviet economy was structured to prioritize heavy industry and military production over consumer needs. Finding basic items like quality shoes, fashionable clothing, or household appliances required patience, connections, and often participation in the black market or Blate system of reciprocal favors. The average Soviet worker in the early 1960s earned about 80 to 90 rubles per month, enough to cover basic necessities, but leaving little for anything beyond survival. Food availability improved compared to the immediate post-war years, but the Soviet diet remained monotonous and limited. Bread, potatoes, cabbage, and cheap cuts of meat formed the staples. Tropical fruits were rare luxuries. The quality of food in state stores was often poor, with long lines forming whenever desirable items became available. Many urban families maintained connections with relatives in the countryside who could provide better quality produce and dairy products. The contrast with Western abundance, increasingly visible through foreign films and the accounts of the few Soviet citizens who traveled abroad, created growing frustration, particularly among the younger generation. The education system represented one of the genuine achievements of the Soviet system under Khrushchev. Education was free at all levels, including university, and literacy rates approached 100%. The Soviet Union produced large numbers of engineers, scientists, and technicians, creating a highly educated workforce. The launch of Sputnik in October 1957, the first artificial satellite, demonstrated Soviet technological prowess and shocked the United States into intensifying its own space and education programs. Yuri Gagarin's orbital flight in April 1961 made him an international hero and seemed to validate Khrushchev's claims about Soviet superiority. The space program provided a source of genuine pride for Soviet citizens and offered evidence that their system could achieve remarkable things. Healthcare was also provided universally and free of charge, a significant achievement that ensured basic medical care for the entire population. However, the quality of care varied enormously. Elite hospitals in Moscow offered services comparable to Western standards, while rural clinics often lacked basic equipment and medicines. The system emphasized preventive care and public health measures, contributing to improvements in life expectancy and infant mortality rates, though these still lagged behind Western levels. The contradiction between official ideology and lived reality created a peculiar form of cognitive dissonance in Soviet society. Citizens were constantly told they lived in the most advanced society in history, building communism and surpassing the decaying capitalist West. Yet their daily experience involved shortages, queuing, cramped living conditions, and limited freedoms. This gap between propaganda and reality led to widespread cynicism, expressed in the dark humor and jokes that became a defining feature of Soviet culture. People learned to navigate the system, to say one thing in public and another in private, to work the informal networks of connections and favors that made life manageable. By 1964, Khrushchev's position had become untenable. His agricultural policies had failed spectacularly. The 1963 grain harvest disaster forced humiliating grain imports from the West. His erratic behavior and constant reorganizations created instability and exhausted the party apparatus. The Cuban Missile Crisis had damaged Soviet prestige. His anti-religious campaigns, which included the closure of thousands of churches and the persecution of believers, alienated many citizens without achieving their goals. His son's defection to the West, though not Khrushchev's fault, was embarrassing. Most fundamentally, he had alienated key constituencies within the Soviet system without building sufficient popular support to compensate. In October 1964, while Khrushchev was vacationing at his dacha on the Black Sea, the Politburo moved against him. He was summoned back to Moscow and confronted with a list of accusations: voluntarism, harebrained schemes, creating a cult of personality, damaging Soviet agriculture, and foreign policy failures. On October 14, 1964, he was forced to resign from all his positions. Unlike previous Soviet power struggles, there was no arrest, no trial, no execution. Khrushchev was allowed to retire to his dacha, where he lived quietly until his death in 1971, writing memoirs that were smuggled to the West and published there. The Khrushchev era represents a crucial transitional period in Soviet history, a moment when the system attempted to reform itself without fundamentally changing its nature. The achievements were real: millions released from camps, a degree of cultural freedom, improved housing, reduced terror, and greater openness to the outside world. But the limitations were equally real. Political repression continued in subtler forms. Economic problems remained unsolved. Agriculture was mismanaged, and the fundamental structures of the command economy and one-party state were preserved intact. For the generation that came of age during the thaw, the period represented both hope and disappointment. They experienced enough freedom to imagine alternatives, but not enough to realize them. They saw the crimes of Stalin acknowledged, but watched as the system that enabled those crimes remained essentially unchanged. They received better education and housing than their parents, but faced continued shortages and restrictions that made daily life a constant struggle. This generation would later provide many of the reformers and dissidents who would push for change in the 1980s, ultimately contributing to the Soviet Union's collapse. The legacy of the Khrushchev years continues to resonate in post-Soviet space today. The Khrushchevkas still house millions of people across the former Soviet Union, their distinctive five-story profiles a permanent reminder of that era's ambitions and limitations. The cultural works of the thaw period remain touchstones of Russian literature and cinema. The memory of de-Stalinization and the secret speech continues to shape debates about how societies confront historical crimes and totalitarian pasts. Khrushchev himself remains a controversial and contradictory figure, neither fully condemned nor fully celebrated. He was the man who revealed Stalin's crimes, but who also sent tanks into Budapest. He improved living standards for millions, but mismanaged agriculture disastrously. He pursued peaceful coexistence, but brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. He opened cultural space, but crudely suppressed artists who went too far. He was a product of the system he tried to reform. Unable to imagine alternatives beyond the Marxist-Leninist framework that had shaped his entire worldview, yet willing to challenge aspects of that system in ways that would have been unthinkable under his predecessor. The fundamental lesson of the Khrushchev era is that genuine reform of totalitarian systems is extraordinarily difficult, perhaps impossible from within. Khrushchev tried to create a more humane socialism, to preserve the Soviet system while eliminating its worst excesses. He succeeded in reducing terror and improving material conditions, but he could not solve the fundamental problems of the command economy, political monopoly, and ideological rigidity. His successors, Brezhnev and the gerontocrats who followed, would abandon even his limited reforms, leading to the stagnation that would ultimately doom the Soviet experiment. The brief opening of the thaw would not come again until Gorbachev's perestroika in the 1980s, and by then it would be too late to save the system. The Soviet Union that Khrushchev tried to reform would survive him by only 27 years, and the world he helped shape through his contradictions and crises continues to influence global politics decades after both he and the system he served have passed into history.